and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. Today we're going to talk about the ghosts of Windsor Castle.
One day we will be remembered.
Happy Halloween, guys! Welcome to our first annual Halloween special. Today I'm going to talk about what a busy place Windsor Castle is in the afterlife. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, these are going to be some pretty interesting stories. When I was structuring this episode and trying to organize all of the ghost stories, I decided it works for an episode of Ghosts. Anybody watch Ghosts? It's funny. So our setting is Windsor Castle. The original Windsor Castle was built by William the Conqueror after his Norman invasion in 1066. It's almost 1,000 years old, so it's a perfect place for ghosts. It wasn't used as a royal residence for decades, but eventually it had been upgraded enough that it became a suitable royal residence. The first ghost that would have appeared on the scene was William Wickham. William Wickham was an architect in the time of King Edward III. Remember the goat, E3? His mother was my very first episode ever, Isabella of France. William Wickham was responsible for many of the upgrades at Windsor Castle during the time of King E3. Think knights in shining armor and chivalry and troubadours. This guy was a very proper architect. His motto was, "Manners maketh man." At the time of his death, he was one of the richest men in England. He is said to be seen wandering around the castle at night, checking that things are all right. When William was a fixture in the building up of Windsor Castle, he would have been in his early 30s. He was the head architect for the Windsor upgrades for King E3, who was in his mid-40s. And he was reportedly friendly with two of the princes, 26-year-old Edward the Black Prince and 16-year-old Prince John of Gaunt. Shout out to my Catherine Swynford girlies out there. I like her too. As William aged, he believed in manners and education. He was a proper guy, and if you believe the stories, he started watching over the Windsor evenings when he died in 1404. Now, William would have been riding solo for about 80 years, doing his castle watching thing. But then he was joined by a second ghost. In the 1480s, the King of England was King Richard III. For long-time listeners of me, please don't come for me, Richard III Society. So, Hearn was King R3's favorite huntsman. According to word on the street, and by that I mean Shakespeare, so take his stories with a grain of salt. He was a historical fiction girly. Hearn saved King R3's life from a stag. That's huntsman expert level. But he was mortally wounded. Mortally wounded, but he didn't die. Why? Witches. He was cured by witchcraft. But as witchcraft often does, it came at a price. A set of antlers grew from his head. I know what you're thinking, that sounds rad. Alas, Hearn did not dig his new look, and he hung himself from an oak tree. Each winter, Hearn returns to this oak tree. Various trees were said to be Hearn's oak, but Queen Victoria named an official Hearn's oak. It fell down in 1836. The logs were burned at Windsor Castle, except for one that was carved into a bust of William Shakespeare. So these were the two 15th century ghosts. I don't get the feeling that these two men would have really gotten along at all necessarily, but it seems like William oversaw the castle and Hearn oversaw the forest just outside the castle. So they would have had their territories. They kept their space. And that's how it stayed for another 50 years. Over that 50 years was the life of King Henry VIII, give or take. So that's our new setting, Windsor Castle in Tudor England. That is when the third ghost would have popped up. In 1536, Henry VIII had his second wife beheaded, Queen Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne Boleyn has some super high-powered ghost shit because she's said to haunt all kinds of places. And honestly, it seems like she spends most of her ghost time at other locations. But occasionally, she is seen at Windsor Castle. This is like her vacation castle. So in 1536, the proper older gentleman and the king's favorite huntsman were joined by an occasional queen. Queen Anne Boleyn, freshly afterlifed and being beheaded on the orders of her angry husband, was maybe not the happiest ghost. Queen's Anne ghosts can be occasionally seen weeping behind a window in the dean's cloister. So, I guess those Windermere Peaks aren't the perfect place to cry. Again, These three seem like an odd throuple, but Queen Anne seems to have kept mostly to herself, and was often out at her other hauntings, because she haunts a lot of places apparently. And they wouldn't have to wait long for their fourth. Just 11 years after Anne Boleyn was executed, her husband died, and he was added to their ghost gang.
I am challenging you to a wrestling match.
So fun times in this afterlife. You get a crying queen and the angry husband that beheaded her.
Groom!
And then moved on with no regrets. King Henry had aged in those years. He had turned from a fit 40-something to an obese, limping, angry 50-something.
I'm not going to sign the treaty.
So, in the Battle of Revenge Bods, Queen Anne was beating King Henry VIII, and she had lost her head on his orders. And she still seemed pretty upset about that, all that crying in the Dean's cloister.
The Holy Roman Emperor!
I'm understanding why Herne hung out in the woods all the time. But poor Will, probably having to remind them to mind their manners. King H8 would not have liked that. Henry is sometimes seen limping around and shouting out orders. So he's very on brand. And now we are in a 4-ghost holding pattern for the next almost 50 years. Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603. And rumor is she was now here too. Imagine you are Elizabeth, you die, and you find yourself in a ghostly afterlife that includes not one but both of your parents. Your mother, who you haven't seen since you were 2.5, is just crying anytime she's there. And your father,
I'm not going to sign the treaty.
who you haven't seen since you were 13, is running around being the same angry tyrant you remember from your childhood.
The Holy Roman Emperor!
To make matters worse, your father beheaded your mother in part because you were female. But the longer story is in Anne Boleyn's episode. But poor Liz, in a castle with her parents who don't like each other very much. And she shows up having to explain to her angry father that he was wrong about needing a male heir because she had arguably had a much more successful reign than her father had. But then, oh, by the way, she had opted out of having children, ending the Tudor line. The line that he had been trying to protect all along. And I'm sure he would have blamed Anne for that. And all three of you live in a castle with a 14th century architect running around and reminding people to mind their manners. And there's a huntsman that hangs out in the woods. Queen E1 has been seen dressed in black, walking around the Queen's library. She's there, and then she isn't. So here we are. It's 17th century, and the Stuarts of Scotland are now on the English throne because Elizabeth chose to never marry. I'm sure her dad, King H8, wouldn't let her forget that. All these Stuarts running around his castle. 25 years after Elizabeth died, they were joined by the sixth ghost, the very best friend and possible boyfriend of King James VI and First, George. Now, I don't know how he fits into this ghost story. He was relatively young, just 35, I think. He would have been good friends with Anne Boleyn. I think they would have vibed. He was just the kind of guy she would have hung out with in her lifetime. And yes, maybe he was a former royal mistress, but so was she. In my head, they are afterlife BFFs. So we have an older, polite architect who has slowly watched his beloved castle fill with drama. From a huntsman with antlers to a family of 3 with so much drama. And now Mom has a gay BFF who's next. They don't have to wait too long. Remember Anne Boleyn's new ghost bestie? Well, he allegedly may have slept with the king. And now, 21 years after he joined the royal afterlife, he would be joined by his old best friend or boyfriend's son, King Charles I. Now, to me, he naturally befriends Queen Elizabeth I. Her mother is crying about the castle, hanging out with his father's possible boyfriend. I feel like they bond in that situation. Though maybe he bonds with Queen Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, as they were both beheaded ghosts. Things hadn't ended well, but something tells me that King C1 would relate to the Boleyn ladies. In February 1649, just a week and a half after King C1 died, they had his funeral at Windsor. Now keep in mind that it was early February, but it was a nice February day, clear skies. As the black draped coffin was being carried towards St. George's Chapel, a blizzard came out of nowhere. Just clear skies, then blizzard. By the time the coffin got to the chapel, the black draperies were covered with snow, and a lot of people thought that was God proclaiming his innocence after his execution. I don't know about that, but if the ghost of King Charles I was there to witness it, I bet he enjoyed it. Freaked everybody out. And the ghost King Charles probably got himself entwined in a rivalry with King Henry, because Henry was a bully and would have definitely wanted to be top king.
Groom!
Around the same time as King C1's ghost arrived, another ghost arrived, a soldier loyal to King Charles, who was captured and imprisoned there. We don't have a lot of info on him, but he would have been a King Charles stan, and definitely on his side in any argument. He hangs out mostly in the prison chamber. Only children can see him, but occasionally adults feel him brush by them. And this is the way it stayed for nearly 200 years. By now, the Stuarts were no longer on the throne. England was in its Hanoverian era. King George III was the King of England. You may know him from Hamilton, or the husband of Queen Charlotte in Bridgerton, or from the famous Madness of King George. During King G3's madness era, he spent a lot of time at Windsor Castle. He would take and return his soldiers' evening salute, and he has been spotted on occasion doing the same in his afterlife. He is also seen sometimes staring sadly out of the window in the room under the library, where he was sometimes held during his episodes. It doesn't seem like this Ghost King was caught up in the battle of the Ghost Kings of England. He was just living his best quiet ghost life, and he seems like he would, despite his madness, have gotten along pretty well with the polite architect. About 80 years after King G3 entered the Ghost Gang, they had another visitor, Queen Victoria. Like Anne Boleyn, this queen reportedly haunts a lot of places, and Windsor isn't her favorite haunting site. But when her grandson ordered a family tree be taken down, the workers arrived to remove it, and the ghost of Queen Victoria arrived, moaning, to shoo them off. And off they went. The family tree stands today. So this is our cast of characters for the Ghosts of Windsor. But there's also a supporting cast backing them up. In 1906, a sentry watched a group of men beyond the main gate approaching. He challenged them, and when they continued, he shot his rifle at them, which caused them to pause for a moment and then continue. The soldier charged into the group, but the group vanished. A full-scale search of the castle and its grounds were undertaken, and no intruders were found. The sentry was grounded to his barracks for 3 days as punishment. In 1927, a soldier patrolling the King's Walk was overcome with melancholy and shot himself. A few weeks later, a friend of his was given the same duty. He heard footsteps behind him and assumed it was his relief soldier. He turned to see his dead friend. He just stared at him until his relief soldier arrived, and his ghost soldier friend disappeared. This story was backed up by various soldiers who all claimed to have seen him. The deanery, I googled it, the deanery is the residence of the Dean of Windsor, and it turns out that it may be a little haunted. It is haunted by a young boy who shouts, "I don't want to go riding today." It is probably his footsteps which are heard in the same building. The kitchen is one of the buildings which make up the horseshoe cloisters and is haunted by a man leading a horse. They walk straight through the wall, for the cloisters were once the cavalry stables. A young girl has also been seen here, standing by a Christmas tree. Ghostly footsteps are heard on the staircase in the curfew tower, and on one occasion, the bells began to swing on their own, while the temperature became distinctly chilly. In 1873, a nighttime visitor to the castle noticed an interesting new statuary group that had been erected near St. George's Chapel. 3 standing figures, all in black, and a 4th crouching down. The central standing character was in the act of striking with a large sword. The sentry knew nothing of this artwork, and when the visitor returned to re-examine it, it had gone. And that is where I'll leave it for now. Tell me, what do you think about the Ghosts of Windsor? They are an interesting group. I'd watch that show. Happy Halloween, guys. Thanks for spending it with me. Long live to all the queens out there, and until next time, bye.
Will be remembered.
Thanks for listening.